Look who just became visible, but not the way anyone predicted. Welcome to the silent builders, the chess players, the ones who vanished while constructing kingdoms nobody could see. Welcome to the ones they labeled finished, erased, gone forever. Welcome to you, because something just unlocked in their minds, something they never anticipated, something that's unraveling them right this second as reality crashes down. They finally understood you weren't collapsing, you were composing, you weren't breaking down, you were breaking through, you weren't screaming in pain, you were silent by design, and everyone around you watched the performance, took their seats, stared at the stage, and never once realized they were witnessing the most brilliant illusion ever crafted. They thought you were the disaster. They thought you were the warning sign. They thought you were the shattered mirror they could reference and whisper, "Look what happens when you aim too high." But the stage just cleared, the spotlight turned on, and you're there claiming your moment while they're still processing what they're seeing. You see, they had you decoded, right? They had you marked, sorted, stored under washed up, finished, done. Another soul who couldn't take the pressure. They composed your obituary while your heart still beat, arranged your farewell while you still moved. And the genius part, the absolutely flawless part, is you allowed it. You didn't argue, you didn't fight back, you didn't show the proof or declare the reality. You just accepted, offered that fragile little expression, and disappeared like you'd embraced failure, like you were retreating to hide and vanish into nothing. But you weren't vanishing. You were preparing. You weren't mending. You were weaponizing. You weren't rebuilding. You were reloading. And the whole time they threw parties for your collapse, you were underground engineering the greatest resurgence they never imagined possible. They interpreted your quiet as giving up. They saw your distance as humiliation. They viewed your exit as fragility. But it was planning. It was deliberate. It was the stillness before the devastation hits. You understood something they missed. You understood that whoever yells hardest isn't always the winner. You understood that whoever protests most desperately is actually the guilty one. You understood that real dominance doesn't broadcast itself. It emerges when the moment is flawless. So you inhabited the role. You dressed as the conquered. You delivered the dialogue of the ruined. You carried yourself like someone who'd surrendered and they consumed it. They swallowed that story like salvation because it satisfied their pride. It verified their dominance. It convinced them they'd triumphed. But here's what's unfolding right now, right this instant. As your identity enters their thoughts again, they're linking evidence they wish they could delete. They're finding sequences they can't ignore. They're understanding that every action you took, every decision that appeared accidental, every instant that resembled disorder, it was scripted. You weren't winging it. You were implementing. You weren't responding. You were controlling. You weren't enduring. You were arranging the climax that would transform their complete perception of everything that happened. They believed they were watching you sink, but you were mastering how to exist beneath the surface. They believed they were watching you shatter, but you were discovering how to flex without fracturing. They believed they were watching your finale, but they were watching your genesis. Now they're reviewing the archives, replaying every moment with different understanding, and suddenly nothing appears the same. That message that felt frantic, it was a trap. That instance, you appeared vulnerable. It was an examination. That phase, you appeared missing. You were precisely where you intended to be. They believed they were observers, but they were players in your design. They believed they were evaluators, but they were specimens in your research. They believed they were champions, but they were background actors in your feature. And you? You were the creator orchestrator and lead of a showcase so authentic that even professionals would surrender. You convinced them they annihilated you while you were simultaneously dismantling their entire existence from within. Listen carefully, because this is where everything twists. The ultimate deception you executed wasn't convincing them you failed. It was making them broadcast your failure so deafeningly that they couldn't detect you ascending. Every mockery they made at your cost, every ridicule they crafted about your demise, every party they organized, it was energy. It was documentation. It was weapons you were collecting for a moment they believed would never arrive. You permitted them their celebration. You permitted them their superiority. You permitted them their platform built on the myth of your destruction. But what they failed to grasp is you constructed that platform. You selected the foundation. You engineered the framework. You calculated exactly how much pressure it could withstand before collapsing. And now they're seated on it, feeling accomplished, feeling confirmed, and they're beginning to sense it trembling. They're beginning to detect the fractures. They're beginning to comprehend that the base they constructed their entire story on is failing because it was fabricated from the start. You offered them a fantasy to embrace. You offered them a tale to comfort themselves. You offered them a version of truth where they were the champions and you were the casualty. But fantasy only functions while everyone participates in the belief. The instant someone challenges it, the instant one crack emerges, the complete delusion explodes. And right now, right this precise moment, the delusion is exploding so violently they can't process clearly. They're confronting questions they're horrified to resolve. What if we misunderstood? What if they were never actually finished? What if this was part of something larger? What if we're not the victors we believed we were? What if we're the characters in someone else's narrative? And that right there, that's the instant you've been constructing toward. That's the instant when the act concludes and truth emerges. You didn't just survive their mission to eliminate you. You archived it. You didn't just outlive their festivities. You captured it. You didn't just disprove them. You made them disprove themselves through their own behavior, through their own statements, through their own superiority frozen in permanent record. The elegant violence of your approach is you never needed to declare your triumph. You simply needed to persist long enough for them to witness it. You never needed to justify your decisions. You simply needed to allow time demonstrate their genius. You never needed to present your argument. You simply needed to allow the outcomes communicate in language so transparent even the blind could see it. You performed lifeless and allowed them to celebrate over your burial. But graves are merely holes in earth until someone occupies them. And you occupied yours with everything they assumed you'd sacrificed, with every ability they assumed you'd never possess, with every alliance they assumed you'd never create, with every achievement they assumed you'd never reach. Now they're observing you emerge from that burial, covered in the soil they scattered on you, displaying it like armor, grinning like someone who understands the revelation to a mystery that hasn't been shared yet. And they're panicking because they finally comprehend. You weren't their prey. You were their instructor. You weren't their loss. You were their education. You weren't their catastrophe. You were their awakening, disguised in a showcase so persuasive they handed you every accolade without understanding they were financing their own collapse. They applauded when you pretended to descend. They roared when you portrayed brokenness. They rejoiced when you enacted loss. And now they must observe the finale and discover their identities recorded under deceived by. You see, the truth about magnificent showcases is they demand magnificent performers, but they also demand a magnificent crowd, a crowd ready to accept, a crowd hungry to witness what they desire to witness, a crowd so committed to the story that they dismiss the inconsistencies. And you brilliant strategist, you delivered exactly what they craved to witness. You presented them a destroyed individual so convincingly that they never searched for the manipulation. You portrayed the conquered so expertly that they never questioned if it was authentic. You embodied failure so entirely that they never considered it was a disguise you could remove whenever you chose. And the most disturbing element, the element that will torment them in the silent hours when they're isolated with their consciousness, is that you savored it. You savored observing them celebrate. You savored witnessing them feel dominant. You savored the showcase as much as they savored experiencing it because you understood something they missed. You understood that every instant of their happiness was borrowed existence. You understood that every mockery at your expense was a liability they were building. You understood that every celebration was another fragment of proof in the proceeding they didn't realize was approaching, where they would be accused, and you would be the prosecutor with evidence so complete they couldn't negotiate, couldn't compromise, couldn't flee. They're grasping it now in cycles, each cycle striking harder than the previous. First, the bewilderment. Wait, that's illogical. Then the uncertainty. Did we overlook something? Then the anxiety. What else did we overlook? Then the dread. Were we mistaken about everything? Then the acknowledgement, the harsh, devastating acknowledgement that they weren't merely mistaken, they were controlled. They weren't merely tricked, they were involved. They weren't merely watchers, they were contributors in their own embarrassment. You converted them into background players in your vindication narrative and charged them for the honor of appearing there. Right now, they're conducting dialogues in secret. Dialogues they'll never confess to openly. Dialogues where they're assembling the sequence, linking the instances, witnessing the design surface like a formation they never observed before. Remember when they stated that? Remember when they executed that action? Remember when they disappeared? Remember when we assumed we'd succeeded? And with each recollection, each memory, each fragment of the mystery, the image becomes sharper and more crushing. The image of someone who manipulated them like tools, who arranged their celebration like a composition, who staged their ridicule like a theatrical show. You know what's genuinely magnificent about this instant, about right now, about them finally grasping what occurred? It's that you don't need to utter a solitary statement. You don't need to boast. You don't need to clarify. You don't need to justify. You don't need to proclaim, because the reality is proclaiming itself. The outcomes are resonating everywhere. The truth is unmistakable. And your silence, that identical silence they interpreted as humiliation, it's now the most deafening presence in existence. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need to demonstrate anything because everything is already demonstrated. The silence of someone who doesn't need confirmation because the result is the confirmation. The silence of someone who understands that the ultimate dominance action is permitting your adversaries acknowledge their own foolishness without your assistance. They desired you to be insignificant so they could feel significant. They desired you to remain fallen so they could remain elevated. They desired you to fail so they could prosper. But what they never grasped is you were never participating in their competition. You were participating in with your own regulations, your own measurement method, your own meaning of success while they were celebrating victory. You were operating multi-dimensional strategy while they were circling triumph laps. You were constructing vessels while they were marking territories on peaks. You were securing entire worlds they didn't know existed. The showcase you delivered wasn't merely persuasive. It was essential. It was tactical. It was the exclusive method to make them expose who they authentically were, to make them display their genuine identities, to make them reveal their actual motivations. Because individuals display who they are when they assume you're helpless, when they assume you're conquered, when they assume you can't retaliate. You generated that delusion not because you were actually helpless, but because you desired to witness what they execute with dominance. You desired to archive their brutality. You desired to capture their celebration. You desired proof of who they transform into when they assume nobody's tracking, and now you possess it. Now you possess every record, every capture, every communication, every mockery, every ridicule, every celebration of your supposed destruction. All marked, all archived, all maintained, not for retaliation, but for security. Not for assault, but for defense. Not for conflict, but for understanding. You discovered exactly who would celebrate your suffering, exactly who would rejoice at your burial, exactly who would grin in your presence while wishing for your failure. And that intelligence, that awareness, that precision, it's valued more than any victory they could fathom. They're beginning to witness what you constructed in darkness. They're beginning to comprehend what you achieved in quiet. They're beginning to grasp what you generated while they were occupied celebrating your elimination. And it's spectacular, it's staggering, it's undeniable, and it's making them challenge everything they assumed they understood. If they could accomplish this while we assumed they were destroyed, what else are they capable of? If they could construct this while we assumed they were eliminated, what else are they constructing right now? If this was them at their minimum, what are they at their maximum? These questions, these frightening questions, they're disturbing their rest, stealing their sleep, possessing their silent instants. You see, you didn't merely make them assume they succeeded. You made them invest in that assumption. You made them risk their standing on it. You made them inform everyone who would hear about your failure, about your destruction, about your loss. And now they must either confess they were mistaken or persist with a deception that's becoming more transparent by the hour. They're imprisoned in a story of their own creation, a narrative they repeated so frequently they began accepting it themselves. But narratives need conclusions. And this narrative's conclusion isn't what they composed. This narrative's conclusion has you vertical, flourishing, radiating, while they're rushing to justify how the body they interred returned to existence more powerful than previously. The recognition you merit isn't for best performer. It's for best mental operation camouflaged as collapse. It's for best tactical withdrawal that resembled capitulation. It's for best display of vulnerability that was actually power accumulating itself. It's for best illusion that made individuals accept exactly what you required them to accept for exactly as long as you required them to accept it. You didn't merely perform. You metamorphosed. You didn't merely simulate. You materialized. You didn't merely occupy a character. You absorbed it so completely that even you began questioning where the character concluded and the authentic you commenced. But here's the secret they're just now uncovering. The character never concluded because there was no character. The part never ceased because there was no part. The showcase never finished because there was no showcase. It was always you. Just you functioning at a dimension of tactical reasoning they couldn't grasp. Just you executing actions they couldn't follow. Just you participating in a competition they didn't realize existed. What resembled performing was actually existing. What appeared as simulating was actually executing. What seemed a showcase was actually implementation of a strategy so advanced it resembled disorder to everyone observing. They assumed your emotions were vulnerability. They were tactics. They assumed your silence was loss. It was surveillance. They assumed your withdrawal was capitulation. It was intelligence gathering. They assumed your collapse was the conclusion. It was the interval. They assumed your failure was lasting. It was temporary positioning. Every solitary thing they interpreted as your destruction was actually arrangement for your ascension. Every instant they witnessed as your conclusion was actually the commencement of their judgment. You weren't disintegrating. You were aligning, positioning yourself, preparing for departure. Now they're experiencing something they've never encountered before, the nauseating recognition that they were mistaken. Not merely mistaken, but dramatically, openly, eternally mistaken. Not merely incorrect, but manipulated. Not merely tricked, but made to appear ridiculous by their own celebration of something that never transpired. They're existing in the consequences of their own arrogance, resting in arrangements they created from assumptions, displaying garments constructed from premature celebrations. And the material is dissolving in present time. Thread by thread, deception by deception, assumption by assumption. You offered them the ultimate gift they never desired. You offered them premier access to their own humiliation. You offered them featured parts in their own destruction. You offered them acknowledgement in a show they'll wish they never participated in. Because now when individuals relate your narrative, and they will relate your narrative, those individuals will be recorded not as your opponents, but as your viewers. Not as your eliminators, but as your acceptors. Not as the ones who destroyed you, but as the ones who purchased admission to a production where they were the joke and never realized it until the closing moment. The stage is cleared, the illumination is present, the venue is vacating, and you're there accepting recognition after recognition after recognition, while they're still in their positions attempting to comprehend what they just experienced, attempting to grasp how they missed it, attempting to understand how someone they assumed was concluded is standing there whole. You're not clarifying, you're not justifying, you're not even recognizing their bewilderment. You're simply existing in your reality, operating in your truth, inhaling your success. And that simple existence, it's more resonant than any declaration, more dominant than any clarification, more crushing than any retaliation. They desired to compose your conclusion. They desired to write your finale. They desired to complete your section. But they forgot one critical element. You're the one possessing the instrument. You're the one composing the narrative. You're the one determining what arrives next, and what arrives next, what's arriving right now. It's the development they never anticipated, the disclosure that reconstructs everything. The instant when the viewers comprehend the individual they assumed was the prey was actually the architect. The instant when the character becomes the mastermind, when the conquered becomes the champion, when the showcase concludes and truth commences.